At 52, I finally figured out why my grocery bill never seemed to match the amount of food I actually ate. And strangely enough, the answer wasn't the price of chicken, eggs, milk, or any of the other things I normally blamed. When I looked at the total on my receipt, it was a bunch of little ingredients sitting quietly in my refrigerator. Ingredients I had bought for exactly one recipe and then practically forgotten about. I remember the evening that finally made me see it. I had found a recipe online for a creamy chicken dish that looked simple enough. The photograph was beautiful. The ingredients didn't seem outrageous. And I remember thinking this would be cheaper than ordering dinner. So I drove to the grocery store with my little list. Chicken breasts, fresh cilantro, a lime, a container of sour cream, a particular cheese, green onions, chicken broth, and one sauce I didn't normally keep in the house. None of those things looked terribly expensive by itself. $3 here, $4 there, maybe another $2 for the herbs. And that is exactly how I used to fool myself. Because I wasn't calculating what the recipe required. I was paying for the packages the grocery store actually sold me. The recipe might have called for 2 tablespoons of sour cream. But I had to buy the whole container. It might have needed a handful of cilantro, but I had to buy the whole bunch. It needed half a lime, but I bought several because they were sitting together in a bag. It used only part of the cheese and a little of the sauce. By the time I reached the checkout, the inexpensive dinner I had imagined had turned into a surprisingly expensive grocery trip. And of course, I added a few things that were never on the list, because that seems to happen every time you walk through a supermarket, thinking you only need 3 things. The dinner itself was good, my husband liked it, I liked it, and that should have been the end of the story. Except a week later, I opened the refrigerator and saw the real cost of that meal. The cilantro had collapsed into a dark, wet bundle at the bottom of the produce drawer. Half the green onions were soft. The sour cream was sitting behind a jar of pickles. The specialty sauce had been pushed into the refrigerator door, where I knew it might remain for the next 6 months. And there was a chunk of cheese beginning to dry around the edges. That was when something clicked for me. I had been judging the cost of food by what I paid at checkout, instead of by how much of what I bought actually became food on my plate, and those are 2 completely different numbers. This matters even more in America right now, because grocery prices are still higher than many of us remember. The latest available national CPI figures show food-at-home prices were 7% higher in June 2026 than a year earlier. So even when inflation slows, or one item happens to go on sale, wasting part of what we buy still makes an already expensive grocery basket hurt more. And I realized I had been spending months trying to beat the grocery store at its own game. Clipping a $1 coupon, comparing the price of chicken at 2 stores, waiting for pasta to go on sale, feeling proud when I saved 75 cents while throwing $4 worth of herbs, vegetables, sauces, and dairy products into the trash at the end of the week. Sometimes I was driving across town to save $2 on meat and then buying $6 of ingredients that would only be used once. It made absolutely no sense. But because the waste happened several days after the shopping trip, I never connected the 2. The money left my checking account on Saturday. The cilantro went into the garbage on Thursday. And in my mind, those felt like completely separate events. They weren't. They were the same purchase. I started looking around my kitchen, and suddenly I saw evidence everywhere. A jar of pesto bought for one pasta recipe, Dijon mustard from a sauce I made once, a can of coconut milk I couldn't remember buying, half a package of tortillas, a spice blend I had seen in a recipe video, a bottle of dressing that tasted good on one particular salad, but apparently nothing else. None of these things had ruined my budget by themselves. That was what made the habit so hard to notice. There was no single dramatic $100 mistake. It was $5 here, $3 there, $7 somewhere else, quietly repeated week after week. And at 52, I had reached the point where I no longer wanted complicated money tricks. I wanted my grocery bill to make sense. So I made one rule that changed the way I shop. Before I put an ingredient into my cart, especially something I don't normally buy, I have to know what its second job will be. If cilantro is going into tacos tonight, it needs somewhere to go tomorrow, maybe a rice bowl, soup, or scrambled eggs. If I buy sour cream, it needs to work on baked potatoes or another dinner later in the week. If I buy spinach, it can't belong to one salad. It has to become eggs, pasta, sandwiches, or soup too. I stopped asking, do I need this for the recipe? And started asking, what will I do with the rest of it? That tiny question completely changed my kitchen because I finally understood that I hadn't been buying groceries. I had been buying individual recipes, and individual recipes had been quietly filling my refrigerator with leftovers that weren't meals. From that week forward, every ingredient that came through my front door needed more than one purpose. And once I started doing that, something happened that surprised me. My grocery list began getting shorter before I had even started trying to spend less. Once I made that rule, something almost embarrassing happened. I started noticing how much food I already owned. Not food in the general sense, but actual usable ingredients that had been hiding in plain sight. I opened my refrigerator one morning, and instead of asking what I needed to buy, I asked a completely different question. What can I make from what is already here? And that question changed everything. Because sitting on the second shelf was half a container of Greek yogurt, 3 eggs, a small piece of cheddar, 2 carrots, part of an onion, a handful of spinach, half a jar of salsa, and some cooked chicken from 2 nights earlier. Before this change, I would have looked at that refrigerator and thought, there's nothing for dinner. Then I would have picked a recipe, written another shopping list, driven back to the store, and probably spent another $40 or $50. Now I looked at the exact same food and saw breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The yogurt could become breakfast or a sauce for chicken wraps. The eggs and spinach could become an omelet. The chicken could go into quesadillas with the salsa and cheddar. The carrots and onion could start a soup. Suddenly, my refrigerator wasn't a collection of leftovers. It was a small grocery store that I had already paid for. And that realization was powerful because grocery shopping had become so automatic for me. I would see an empty space in the refrigerator and assume I needed to fill it. I would see a recipe online and immediately think about what I needed to purchase. I almost never stopped to ask whether something already in my kitchen could do the same job. And when grocery prices are putting pressure on household budgets, that habit becomes expensive very quickly, especially with fresh foods that do not give you unlimited time to decide what to do with them. Vegetables, herbs, dairy products, bread, and fruit all come with a clock attached. Every day they sit unused. Part of the money I spent on them gets closer to becoming garbage. So I started what I call my second meal rule. If I put something in my shopping cart, I need to know at least one more meal where it will be used. Not someday, not maybe, but an actual second meal. If I buy cabbage for tacos, I already know the rest can go into stir-fry or soup. If I buy Greek yogurt for breakfast, it can become a creamy dressing or replace sour cream later in the week. If I buy a rotisserie chicken, dinner is only its first job, lunch sandwiches are its second job, soup may be its third, and even the bones can flavor broth if I feel ambitious. I began doing the same thing with vegetables. Spinach was no longer a salad ingredient. Spinach became a breakfast ingredient, a pasta ingredient, a sandwich ingredient, and something I could throw into soup before it went bad. Carrots became snacks, roasted vegetables, soup, and stir-fry. Potatoes became dinner one night, breakfast the next morning, and the base of a simple soup later in the week. Nothing about this was revolutionary. My grandmother would probably have laughed at me for taking so long to figure it out, because this was simply how kitchens used to work. Ingredients belonged to the household, not to individual recipes, but somewhere along the way, I had started shopping as if every dinner needed its own cast of characters. Monday's ingredients had nothing to do with Tuesday's ingredients. Tuesdays had nothing to do with Wednesdays. And by Friday, I had a refrigerator full of partial packages that could not quite become a meal. That was when I understood why my grocery bill had felt so confusing. I was buying plenty of food, but I wasn't buying enough connection between the food. Every recipe was creating another little island in my refrigerator. A half-used sauce over here, a bundle of herbs over there, one specialty cheese in the back, one vegetable that only made sense with a dinner I had already eaten, and none of those islands connected, so I began linking them before I ever entered the store. If Tuesday's dinner required green onions, I made sure Thursday's dinner could use green onions too. If I bought tortillas, I planned tacos, breakfast wraps, or quesadillas. If I needed broth for soup, I made sure another meal that week could use what remained. And I noticed something else. Specialty ingredients were usually where my grocery list became dangerous. A recipe would call for a particular vinegar, a new sauce, an unusual spice, or some cheese I rarely bought. And because each item seemed small, I would add it without thinking. Then those little purchases would follow me home and live in the refrigerator or pantry for months. So I created another question for myself. Can something I already own do nearly the same job? Maybe lemon juice could replace a specialty vinegar? Maybe plain yogurt could replace a special sauce? Maybe cheddar could work instead of buying another cheese. I stopped treating recipes like legal contracts that had to be followed word for word. Dinner did not have to look exactly like the picture on my phone. It just had to taste good and use what I had. And the more flexible I became, the less food I threw away. The funny part was that I didn't feel deprived. I actually felt more creative because instead of opening the refrigerator and seeing random leftovers, I began seeing possibilities. Half a roasted chicken became tacos, cooked rice became fried rice, vegetables became soup, leftover bread became toast or breadcrumbs. Even a small amount of cheese suddenly had a destination. And over time, I noticed that my grocery cart looked different too. There were fewer novelty ingredients, fewer things purchased for a single dinner, and more foods that could move easily from one meal to another. I still tried new recipes. I still bought something special once in a while. But I stopped letting one recipe dictate an entire shopping trip. And that was the moment my grocery budget finally started behaving like a system instead of a series of surprises. Because the problem had never been that I needed cheaper recipes. The problem was that I needed recipes that could talk to each other. The next change I made was even simpler. I stopped planning 7 completely different dinners, because that was one of the biggest reasons my grocery list kept getting longer. I used to sit down on Sunday with good intentions and write out an impressive little meal plan. Monday might be pasta with a special sauce. Tuesday might be tacos. Wednesday might be an Asian-style stir-fry. Thursday might be Mediterranean chicken. Friday might be homemade pizza. And every meal sounded reasonable by itself. But when I combined all the ingredient lists, I had created a shopping cart full of foods that barely had anything in common. One recipe needed basil, another needed cilantro, another needed green onions, another needed feta, another needed mozzarella. One called for tortillas, another for naan, another for a particular noodle, another for a sauce I did not already own. By the end of the week, I had planned 5 dinners, but somehow purchased enough ingredients for 15. So I reversed the process. Instead of choosing meals first, I started choosing a small group of flexible ingredients first. Then I asked how many meals I could build around them. One week I might start with chicken, eggs, rice, potatoes, onions, carrots, cabbage, spinach, tortillas, cheddar, bread, yogurt, canned tomatoes, and broth. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would impress anyone on social media, but those ingredients could become an incredible number of meals. Roasted chicken with potatoes one night, chicken tacos the next, rice bowls with vegetables, scrambled eggs with spinach, quesadillas, baked potatoes topped with yogurt and cheese, soup made from chicken, carrots, onions, and broth. fried rice using the vegetables that needed to be eaten. Suddenly, the same 12 or 15 ingredients could carry me through most of the week. And because they overlapped, I actually finished them. This completely changed the way I looked at meal planning. I no longer asked, "What do I feel like cooking on Thursday?" I asked, "What needs to be used by Thursday?" That sounds like a small difference, but financially it was enormous. Because food that gets eaten is always cheaper than food that gets thrown away. Even if the sticker price is slightly higher, I also stopped assuming that the biggest package was automatically the best deal. Grocery stores train us to look at unit price, and unit price is useful, but only if you actually consume the whole package. A larger container of spinach might technically cost less per ounce, but if half of it turns slimy in my refrigerator, then it was not the cheaper choice for me. The same thing applies to warehouse-sized sauces, oversized bags of produce, large tubs of dairy, and family packs of meat. Sometimes buying more saves money. Sometimes buying more simply gives you more opportunities to waste food. And at 52, I finally started measuring value by what reached the table, not by what looked cheapest on the shelf. I also became much more comfortable freezing things. If I bought chicken on sale, I divided it before putting it away, some for this week, some for the freezer. If bread was starting to sit too long, I froze half the loaf. If I made too much rice, I cooled it properly and saved it for another meal. If vegetables were getting close to the end of their best days, I cooked them instead of waiting for the perfect recipe, because that was another habit I had to break. I used to save ingredients for the meal I had imagined, and sometimes that meal never happened. I would think, "I'm saving those mushrooms for Thursday." Then Thursday became takeout because I was tired. Friday we ate leftovers, and by Saturday the mushrooms were finished. Now I use the ingredient when it needs to be used, not when the original plan tells me to use it. Meal planning became flexible instead of rigid, and that flexibility saved more money than any complicated spreadsheet ever did, because real life changes. People get tired, schedules shift, someone invites you out. You decide you do not want the meal you planned 3 days ago. A good grocery system has to survive real life, not just look organized on paper. So I began building what I call meal families. Tacos, quesadillas, rice bowls, and wraps could share chicken, cheese, tortillas, salsa, onions, and greens. Soup, roasted vegetables, and baked potatoes could share carrots, onions, potatoes, broth, and herbs. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner could all use eggs, bread, yogurt, cheese, and spinach. The more overlap I created, the fewer emergencies I had at 5 o'clock, and those 5 o'clock emergencies had been expensive. Because when I thought there was nothing to eat, I often ended up ordering food or making another grocery run, and another grocery run almost never meant buying only the one missing ingredient. I would walk in for tortillas and somehow leave with snacks, drinks, fruit, a sale item, and something from the bakery. So, reducing the number of different ingredients did more than reduce my grocery bill. It reduced the number of reasons I had to go back to the store, and that mattered even more in a country where so many of us have to drive to buy groceries. Because every extra trip costs more than the price printed on the receipt, there is gasoline, mileage, time, and the temptation of everything else you pass in the store. Once I started planning ingredients instead of isolated recipes, my kitchen became calmer, my list became shorter, and dinner became easier. I was no longer trying to create 7 completely different restaurant-style experiences at home every week. I was simply trying to make good food from a small group of ingredients that knew how to work together, and strangely enough, that was when I started feeling like I had more options, not fewer, because when every ingredient had several possible jobs, I could change my mind without destroying the budget. And that was the first time my meal plan actually matched the way I lived. Once I stopped buying ingredients for isolated recipes, I noticed another expense I had never really counted. The grocery bill wasn't the only thing my old shopping habit was costing me. Every time I realized on Wednesday afternoon that I was missing one ingredient for dinner, I got in the car and went back to the store, and almost every one of those trips began with the same sentence, "I'm only going in for one thing." Maybe it was tortillas, chicken broth, sour cream, a lemon, or some special sauce a recipe said I needed. But somehow that one missing ingredient rarely stayed one item. I would walk past the bakery and remember we were low on bread, see strawberries that looked good, notice crackers on sale, grab another carton of eggs just in case, maybe pick up a drink near the checkout, and suddenly a $4 ingredient had turned into a $25 trip, sometimes more. And for years I treated that as a grocery problem, but it was really a transportation problem, a planning problem, and an impulse spending problem, all happening at the same time. That matters even more in America because many of us do not live within walking distance of a supermarket. Especially in suburban and rural communities, getting groceries often means getting into a car, driving several miles, sitting at traffic lights, finding parking, walking through a store designed to show you thousands of things you did not come in to buy, then driving home again. And in 2026, those extra drives are not invisible expenses. According to the latest July 2026 Consumer Price Index, gasoline prices were 24.6% higher than a year earlier, even though gasoline fell 2.9% during July itself, while electricity was 2% higher over the year. So when I started looking at my grocery habits honestly, I realized that an unnecessary store run had a cost before I even walked through the automatic doors. I was putting miles on the car, using gasoline, spending time, and exposing myself to another round of advertising, promotions, end caps, loyalty offers, and impulse purchases. And once I started thinking that way, driving across town to save 75 cents on yogurt suddenly looked a little silly. I used to feel successful if one supermarket had chicken $2 cheaper than another, but if I burned fuel getting there and bought 3 things I had not planned to buy, I had not saved $2 at all. I had simply moved the expense somewhere else. There was another piece I had never paid much attention to either. Taxes. Grocery taxes in the United States are not one simple national rule. They vary by state and sometimes by local jurisdiction. Many places exempt basic groceries from the general sales tax, while others treat food differently or allow local taxes, and prepared foods can be taxed differently from ordinary grocery items depending on where you live. Illinois, for example, eliminated its 1% state sales tax on qualifying food beginning January 1, 2026, but some local jurisdictions chose to impose their own local food taxes. Arkansas also exempted food and food ingredients from state sales tax beginning in 2026, while allowing local taxes to remain, which reminded me that the price printed on a shelf is not always the complete story of what a household eventually pays. None of that meant I needed to become a tax expert just to buy dinner. It simply made me more aware that every extra purchase creates another opportunity for money to leave the household, and the easiest purchase to control is often the one I never make, so I started grouping my grocery needs together. Instead of running out every time one ingredient was missing, I kept a small list on the refrigerator. If we were running low on mustard, it went. If I used the last onion, it went on the list. If I had enough eggs to make it until the next planned trip, I did not rush out and buy another dozen immediately. I also became more willing to substitute. If a recipe called for parsley and I already had cilantro, I asked whether cilantro would work. If it called for sour cream and I had plain Greek yogurt, I used the yogurt. If it wanted one specific cheese, but cheddar was already open, cheddar usually won. Dinner did not collapse because I refused to make a second trip to the grocery store. In fact, most of the time nobody even noticed. And that taught me something important about frugality after 50. Saving money is not always about finding the lowest price. Sometimes it is about reducing the number of decisions that put you in front of another cash register. Because the fewer times I entered a store, the fewer chances I had to spend money. I had never intended to spend. By this point, I was usually shopping once a week, sometimes stretching longer when the freezer and pantry were full. And I started thinking of every additional trip as something that needed a very good reason, not because I wanted to make life inconvenient, but because convenience had been quietly charging me for years. And once I understood that, I stopped driving across town to save 50 cents on tomatoes while spending far more than 50 cents just creating another shopping trip. My grocery bill was finally beginning to make sense because I had stopped looking only at the receipt. I was looking at the whole system that brought food into my house. By the time I reached this point, I realized I did not need another clever grocery trick. I needed a boring system I could repeat every single week, because the problem with most money-saving ideas is that they work beautifully for 3 days, and then real life gets involved. Somebody comes home late, you are tired, plans change, you forget to thaw something, the recipe you planned suddenly sounds terrible. And if your whole grocery budget depends on perfect behavior, it is going to fall apart. So, I made my system simple enough to survive an ordinary Tuesday. Before I write a shopping list, I check the refrigerator first, then the freezer, then the pantry, and only after that do I decide what is actually missing. That order matters, because I used to do it backwards. I would choose meals first, make a list second, and look inside my kitchen last, which meant I was constantly buying duplicates. Another bag of rice when I already had one behind the cereal. Another can of tomatoes when there were 4 in the pantry. Another block of cheese because I forgot there was half a block in the refrigerator drawer. Now I shop my kitchen before I shop the store. And sometimes that one habit removes 10 things from my grocery list before I even leave the house. Then I divide what I buy into a few simple categories. I keep a small group of core foods that are inexpensive, flexible, and easy to turn into meals, things like oats, rice, potatoes, beans, pasta, canned tomatoes, eggs, and bread. Then I buy the perishables we will realistically use during the week: milk, yogurt, fruit, vegetables, greens, and whatever bread products we need. Then I choose 1 or 2 flexible proteins, depending on prices, and what is already in the freezer, maybe chicken, ground turkey, beans, eggs, or occasionally a larger piece of meat that can stretch across several meals. And then comes the category that used to cause me the most trouble: flavor ingredients, sauces, herbs, cheeses, condiments, spice blends, specialty items, the things that make recipes exciting but can quietly turn a short grocery list into an expensive one. I did not ban those foods. I simply created a test. If I am buying something new, I need to know how I will use it at least 2 or 3 times before it goes bad. If I cannot answer that question, I either find a substitute, choose another recipe, or leave it on the shelf. And that one rule has probably saved me more than all the coupons I used to chase. Because coupons encourage you to feel successful when you spend less on something, but the cheapest item is still expensive if you never finish it. I also started treating leftovers differently. I stopped calling them leftovers in my head and started calling them ingredients. That sounds silly, but it changed the way I used them. Leftover chicken was not yesterday's dinner. It was tomorrow's quesadilla filling. Leftover roasted vegetables were not scraps. They were the beginning of an omelet or soup. Extra rice was not something to push into the refrigerator and forget. It was already halfway to fried rice. Half an onion was not clutter. It was part of tomorrow's lunch. Even a piece of bread that was starting to dry had a job as toast, croutons, or breadcrumbs. This made the kitchen feel completely different, because instead of constantly trying to create meals from scratch, I began carrying food forward from one meal into the next. Dinner on Monday helped build lunch on Tuesday. Tuesday's vegetables helped build Wednesday's soup. Wednesday's rice helped build Thursday's stir-fry. And suddenly, cooking did not feel like starting over every day. It felt like continuing something. I also started paying attention to the order in which food needed to be eaten. If spinach was looking tired, spinach moved to the front of the line. If bananas were getting soft, they became breakfast. If yogurt was getting close to the date on the container, I used it before opening something new. I stopped saving the most perishable food for the perfect meal, because the perfect meal often never came. Instead, I created what I jokingly call the Eat Me First section of the refrigerator, one small area where I put anything that needs attention, half an avocado, cooked chicken, cut vegetables, an open container of yogurt, a small piece of cheese. If it is there, I see it before I see the unopened food, and that little visual reminder has stopped more waste than I expected. Another thing I changed was how I responded to sales. I used to see a big yellow sign and think, this is my chance to save money. Now I ask, would I buy this if it were not on sale? And do I already know how I will use it? Because a sale is not savings if it convinces me to buy something I did not need. The same is true for warehouse-size packages, buy one get one promotions, and loyalty deals. They can be wonderful when the food is something you already use, but they can be expensive when they simply increase the amount you throw away. At 52, I no longer wanted a pantry full of deals. I wanted a kitchen full of food that actually became meals. And the biggest surprise was how peaceful this system felt. I was spending less time deciding what to cook, less time wandering through stores, less time throwing away forgotten food, and less time feeling guilty about ingredients I had bought with good intentions. There was nothing dramatic about it. No extreme couponing. No eating the same meal 7 nights in a row. No complicated spreadsheet taped to the refrigerator. Just a small group of foods that could work together. A weekly check of what I already owned. And one question before every unusual purchase. What is this ingredient's second job? Once that question became automatic, my grocery bill finally started reflecting the food we actually ate, instead of the recipes I imagined I might make. The biggest surprise was that my grocery bill did not suddenly become cheap. I wish I could tell you that one little rule magically brought grocery prices back to what I remembered paying 10 or 15 years ago, but that is not how life works. Food still costs what it costs, prices still move up and down, sales still come and go, and there will always be weeks when meat, produce, dairy, or something else feels unusually expensive. In fact, the latest national figures available, as I made this change, showed that food-at-home prices were still higher than they had been a year earlier. So I finally stopped measuring success by whether I could control the price of groceries. Because I cannot control that. I cannot control what a farmer has to pay, what a trucking company has to pay, what it costs to keep a supermarket refrigerated, what happens to crops because of weather, or what price eventually appears on the shelf. But I can control what happens after that food enters my house, and that turned out to be much more powerful than I expected. I can control whether I buy cilantro for 1 dinner or 3. I can control whether I purchase another sauce when 5 bottles are already sitting in my refrigerator door. I can control whether I plan meals around what I already have or start every Monday as if my kitchen were completely empty. I can control whether leftover chicken becomes tomorrow's lunch or gets forgotten behind the milk. And once I focused on those things, my grocery bill finally started making sense. Not because every receipt was smaller than the one before it, but because I could look at what I bought and understand exactly where it was going. Nearly everything had a job, and most things had more than one. I remember opening my refrigerator after I had been shopping this way for a while and thinking it looked strangely empty compared with the way it used to look. There were fewer jars, fewer half-used containers, fewer vegetables stuffed into drawers, fewer ingredients waiting for some future recipe. And for a moment, I wondered whether I had gone too far. Then dinner came around, and I realized something important. The refrigerator looked emptier, but I had more meals. I had chicken that could become dinner and lunch, eggs that could work morning or night, vegetables that could go into soup, rice bowls or omelets, tortillas that could become tacos or quesadillas, yogurt that could become breakfast or a sauce. There was less food sitting there, but more of it worked together. And that is when I understood the difference between having a full refrigerator and having a useful refrigerator. I used to feel secure when every shelf was packed, but much of that fullness was really money waiting to expire. Now I feel more secure, knowing exactly what I own and knowing how I am going to use it. Another thing changed too. I stopped feeling guilty when I decided not to make a recipe exactly as written. If a recipe called for 3 fresh herbs and I only had one, I used one. If it called for a specialty cheese and cheddar was already open, I used cheddar. If it wanted one particular vegetable, but carrots needed to be eaten, carrots went into dinner. Maybe a professional chef would notice the difference. But at my kitchen table, nobody complained, and my bank account certainly did not complain. I had spent years believing that being good at grocery shopping meant knowing where the bargains were. Now, I think being good at grocery shopping means knowing what will actually get eaten, because a bargain that goes into the trash was never a bargain, and an ingredient that costs a little more but gets used 3 different ways can sometimes be the better value. That lesson became especially important to me at 52, because this stage of life has made me think differently about money. I am not interested in winning a $5 battle at the supermarket while losing $50 through waste. I am not interested in filling cabinets just because something is on sale, and I am definitely not interested in spending my time driving from store to store chasing tiny price differences, while food I already paid for is sitting at home waiting to be used. I want less waste, fewer unnecessary trips, fewer decisions, and more room in the budget for things that actually matter. So now when I see a beautiful recipe online, I still enjoy it. I still try new things. But before I add anything unusual to my grocery list, I ask one question: what is this ingredient's second job? If I have a good answer, it can come home with me. If I do not, I usually find another way, and that one question has changed the entire rhythm of my kitchen. I no longer shop for 7 separate dinners. I shop for a small group of foods that can keep becoming something else until they are gone. Monday's chicken can help with Tuesday's lunch. Tuesday's vegetables can become Wednesday's soup. Wednesday's rice can become Thursday's fried rice. And by the end of the week, I am no longer staring at a refrigerator full of random ingredients, wondering why I need another grocery trip. I am looking at a few things that need to be finished, and that tells me exactly what to cook next. So, if your grocery bill feels bigger than the amount of food you are actually eating, I would not start by searching for a complicated budget system. I would open the refrigerator, look at every jar, every half-used vegetable, every specialty ingredient, and ask yourself one simple question: did I buy this because my household really uses it? Or did I buy it because one recipe told me to? Because that was the question that finally changed things for me. At 52, I stopped buying recipes and started buying ingredients that worked together. And once I did that, I did not just get a shorter grocery list. I got a calmer kitchen, less food in the trash, fewer unnecessary store trips. And for the first time in a long time, a grocery bill that actually made sense. If you are trying to simplify your spending after 52, take 5 minutes tonight and find one ingredient in your kitchen that needs a second job. Build tomorrow's meal around it before buying anything else. And if you enjoy practical ways to make everyday life simpler and more affordable after 50, subscribe and stay with me, because the next change I made was to build an entire week of meals around what needed to be used up first. And my grocery list got surprisingly short.